Summary of Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Russell Hochschild. The well-known progressive sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild, who teaches at the University of California, Berkeley, wrote this book to try to figure out what makes people on the right in the United States vote the way they do. Hochschild noticed that most liberal political analyses focus on people's economic and political self-interest instead of the emotions that she says really drive political behavior. This is because political party affiliation has become the main way that people divide into groups in American society. Most analyses agree that conservatives' actions are confusing because, even though red states have worse economic, health, environmental, and educational outcomes than blue states, people who live in red states often vote against public programs that would make their lives better. Hochschild calls this the Great Paradox. Her research, on the other hand, tries to figure out the deep story behind how conservatives feel about themselves, their place in modern American society, and their interactions with other groups. She wants to write a version of this story and show that people from the other party can be understood if we try to understand them. To do this, Hochschild talked to mostly older, white, middle, and working-class Christian conservatives in southwest Louisiana, mostly around the city of Lake Charles, for 5 years. She looked at environmental pollution as a keyhole issue to get a better understanding of the Great Paradox. She found that white Louisianans' strong opposition to government regulation may seem contradictory from a political self-interest point of view, but it makes perfect sense when you think about their deep story of how they see their honor, their limited opportunities in modern America, and the loss of the traditional Southern endurance. Tries to explain the Great Paradox in the first part of her book by going over some Louisianans who are good examples of it. She meets Mike Schaff, who used to work in the oil industry and whose town had to be evacuated because of a drilling accident that made a huge sinkhole in the bayou. Environmental rules could have stopped the accident, but Schaff is against them because, like many Tea Party voters, he wants to cut the Federal Environmental Protection Agency by a lot. Hochschild thinks Mike's behavior is a great example of the Great Paradox, and she can't figure out why he doesn't want to follow the rules that would have saved his house. She thinks that an empathy wall is stopping them from understanding each other, but she hopes that through her research, she can learn how to get past these walls. Next, she meets Lee Sherman, who used to work for the petrochemical company Pittsburgh Plate Glass, PPG, and put in and fixed pipes that carried dangerous hydrocarbons. PPG didn't care about safety and told Lee to secretly dump toxic waste in the bayou at night. When Lee got sick, he was fired without any warning. Just like Mike, Lee still doesn't agree with environmental rules because he thinks they are an unhealthy example of the government going too far. Harold and Annette Areno, who live on the Bayou D'In downstream from where Lee dumped PPG's toxic waste, are one of the families Hochschild talks about. Harold grew up right across the bayou from where his family had farmed and raised animals for more than 100 years. But after the illegal dump, everything in the bayou died out all of a sudden, and the Areno family got cancer, almost all of them. The Arenos do want to protect the environment, but they don't trust Democrats. Instead, they vote Republican because they have a strong faith in the Bible, even though they know that Republicans won't do anything to help them. Hochschild then looks into the rules of politics that have made Louisiana the center of the Great Paradox. She follows the campaign of 2 Republicans who support oil and think that economic growth and government rules can't go together. Then she meets Army General Russell Honoré, an environmental activist and gubernatorial candidate, who says that these Republicans are part of a psychological program that makes Louisianans think they have to choose between their jobs and the environment. So, Hochschild asks Dr. Paul Templet, a scientist from Louisiana who used to work as a regulator, what oil's real role is in the state's economy. He says the business hasn't done much or anything for the state. In order to pay for a tax break for oil companies, Governor Bobby Jindal destroyed Louisiana's public sector. However, most oil jobs are now automated or filled by people from out of state, and an MIT study found a link between stricter rules and economic growth. Hochschild's book has 2 parts. The second part looks at the social terrain that shapes Southwest Louisiana's unique culture. First, she looks at how the oil industry controls the town of Westlake by talking to Bob Hardy, the mayor, who is very loyal to the industry. Hardy is excited that Sasol, a South African petrochemical company, wants to build a huge complex in his town, but Westlake has nothing to gain from the project. Next, Hochschild goes back to Mike Schaaf's story to look at how Louisiana's laws are set up. A drilling company called Texas Brine did careless things that caused a sinkhole to take over most of Bayou Corn. The disaster was made worse by Louisiana's culture of lax regulation, and Mike has every right to hate the regulators because he sees them as squandering tax dollars from hardworking people. Hochschild then takes a look at how the church and the media affect how Louisianans think about politics. Almost everyone she meets goes to church and watches Fox News every week. Hochschild sees that in Louisiana, churches do a lot of the same things that the government does in blue states. But when things get hard, they often stress faith and endurance over action. A lot of people in Louisiana look to Fox News for moral advice. Hochschild sees how it takes her friends' worries and defends their values against a growing liberal consensus that seems to look down on them. On the other hand, Louisianans don't read or watch much media that talks about pollution, which may be one reason why they don't talk about it much. Hochschild comes to the conclusion that people in Louisiana don't need to think or talk about pollution because their social institutions make it normal for people to not do anything about it. Strangers in Their Own Land's third part is about Louisianans' deep story and the conflict between their endurance self and their cosmopolitan self. Hochschild draws a picture of this deep story. Imagine patiently waiting in line for the American dream and working hard for the promise of moving up in your career, only to find that other people, women, Black and Latino Americans, immigrants and refugees, LGBT people, and government workers who live off of other people's tax money, are being allowed to cut in front of you. Voters in the Tea Party believe that welfare programs and affirmative action go against a basic principle of fairness. Hochschild thinks that the rise of identity politics since the 1960s, media stereotypes that show African Americans as either rich celebrities or ungrateful welfare recipients, and the fact that white Southerners are losing their jobs are all big parts of this complicated story. Hochschild says that they see themselves as makers fighting the takers. The left sees a class conflict between the very rich 1% and the 99% whose incomes are becoming more unstable. The right, on the other hand, sees middle-class whites fighting with poor minorities who don't deserve it over limited resources. Because of this, a lot of people on the right look up to the very rich as heroes. Hochschild thinks that this view comes from the endurance self that Southern conservatives hold on to against the cosmopolitan self that liberals value, which values diversity and inclusion. The team loyalist, the worshiper, and the cowboy are the three faces of the endurance self that she looks at. First, she talks about Team Loyalist, which is led by staunch Republican Janice Areno, who has spent her whole life helping her large family and will defend her party no matter what, even if it means polluting the environment because she believes the economic benefits of oil and petrochemicals are greater. Hochschild then talks about the worshiper, who is shown by Jackie Tabor. Tabor grew up in a poor and abusive family, but she learned to survive when she realized that she would get what she deserved if she gave up her wants and let God take over. As an adult, she has chosen to put her husband's needs ahead of her own, which she thinks is necessary in a good Christian marriage. Lastly, Hochschild looks at a debate that happens over and over again at dinner parties between Mike Tritico, a marine biologist from the area, and Donnie McCorkadale, a cowboy friend who he has had for life. Donnie has always picked jobs that are dangerous because he thinks it shows honor to be willing to take risks. He really doesn't like environmentalists or government officials who try to tell people what risks are okay to take. Hochschild then shows how Mike Schaaf's mix of Tea Party politics and environmental activism is based on an endurance self that takes parts from the Team Loyalist, the worshiper, and the cowboy. Hochschild looks at the national trends that have led to the rise of Tea Party conservatism in the South in her last 3 chapters. She says that Southern whites see the rise of the cosmopolitan self as yet another moral intrusion into their way of life because of the history of Northern moral interference in the South, especially during the Civil War and the Civil Rights movements. While the rest of the country thought less of them, white people in the South tried to regain their sense of honor by putting money back into the endurance selves they thought were in danger. Hochschild then talks about the rise of Donald Trump, who started running for office in Hochschild's fifth and final year of research. Many of her subjects loved Trump. She says that Trump's style of persuasion, which relies on emotion instead of logic, was especially appealing to white conservatives who felt left out and stifled by liberal politically correct rules about how to feel. She shows that Trump played on people's emotional self-interest and says that this is the real reason why people voted in ways that may seem strange to experts at first. Hochschild's last chapter goes back to the differences between red and blue states. She writes heartfelt letters to people on both sides of the political spectrum, encouraging them to see how liberal and conservative values and frustrations are similar. Hochschild says that each side is reacting in a different way to the structural squeeze that changing global capitalism is putting on them. For example, when opportunity for most Americans stays the same, the left blames the concentration of wealth and invests in the public sphere, while the right blames competition over jobs and tries to keep the government out of the private sphere, which they believe will bring prosperity. Liberals and conservatives may not be able to change their fundamental beliefs through empathy, but Hochschild thinks it can help them work together on many issues where the main differences are not between left and right, but between establishment and anti-establishment, or global capitalism and conventional capitalism. Hochschild wrote the afterword to the paperback edition of Strangers in Their Own Land about a year after Donald Trump's shocking election. It is about how Louisianans first felt about his presidency and how they felt about the racism that many liberals saw as central to Trump's campaign. The EPA has lost a lot of money since Trump took office, and it doesn't look like the environmental problems in Louisiana will get better anytime soon. Most of Hochschild's friends there were still very happy about Trump's win, though. Many people didn't like how rude he was, and most of them quickly condemned what he said about the white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, in 2017. Hochschild says that even though Louisianans don't hate other groups in a unitary way, they still agree with many racist sub-narratives about certain issues because they don't know much about history and get most of their ideas about Black Americans from media stereotypes. Hochschild comes to the conclusion that robots, which will take over half of current jobs by 2055, are the real line cutters. This means that workers of all races and parties are at risk. For this reason, the U.S. needs new ways to get acquainted across our differences, new frontiers of intermixture, so that people who think they are on opposite sides can see the things they actually have in common.
About the author. Arlie Hochschild was born in Boston, Massachusetts. She wrote in her collection of essays, The Commercialization of Intimate Life, that she grew up in a home where my mother was the sad caretaker and my father the happy non-caretaker. Her father was the U.S. ambassador to Ghana, Tunisia, and New Zealand. In the introduction to Strangers in Their Own Land, she talks about how traveling with her father made her feel like it was her job to reach out to people from very different cultures. This experience was a big part of how she came to write this book. Due to her family's traditional but unsatisfying gender roles, she focused most of her research on how families change. Her innovative way of studying how these changes affect people's emotions has led many to call her the founder of the sociology of emotion. Hochschild famously came up with the idea of emotional labor in her 1983 book The Managed Heart, Commercialization of Human Feeling. This is work that involves people expressing and controlling their emotions. In the book, flight attendants and bill collectors were used as examples. But her next book, The Second Shift, Working Parents and the Revolution at Home, was the one that made her famous and had the most impact on people. In it, she argued that working mothers are stuck between traditional and egalitarian roles, doing most of the housework and working full-time. She has also written 2 books of essays, one edited and one original. The Time Bind was about working parents trying to balance work and family time. The Outsourced Self was about places where someone else's love is another person's commodity, like surrogate mothers, nannies, and dating coaches. Hochschild's work stands out because it uses in-depth interviews, focuses on the emotional effects of changing family and work structures, and carefully criticizes the unintended effects of second-wave feminism.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.